there is a level of categorization that we seem to manifest more or less automatically or implicitly. So for example, when children perceive animals, they perceive at the level of cat or dog. They don't perceive at the level of subspecies like Siamese cat or let's say Samoyed. You know, there's a natural, I can't remember what they call that, base category, something like that. It's usually specified by very short words that are easily learnable, and so the linguistic system seems to map right on to the object recognition characteristics of the sensory systems that are built right into it. And if they weren't built into it, we couldn't communicate easily, because our natural categories, I think that's it, but it's probably wrong. Our natural categories, they have to be the same for everyone, or it would be very difficult for us to communicate. Okay, so having said all that, then the question is, well, what are the most real categories? And I think there's a real division in ways to think about this, because there's a scientific way of thinking about it, and in that case the most real categories are, well, mathematical equations certainly seem to be in the top category there, the equations that describe the physical universe. But then the hypothesis of the existence of such things as protons and electrons, and you know, the material elements that make up everything, that's every element of being, with the possible exception of empty space. But in the mythological world, the categories, I think, are more derived from Darwinian, by the effect of Darwinian processes on cognitive and perceptual function. So which is to say that we have learned to perceive and then to infer those things that are most necessary for us in order to continue our existence, propagate, live well, all of those things. And that would be true at the level of individual survival, and maybe it's also true at the level of group survival, although, you know, there's a tremendous debate among evolutionary biologists about whether or not selection can take place at the level of the group. Anyways, there are these basic level categories that manifest themselves to you, and then there's categories of the imagination that you have to infer up from the sensory domain. And we do that partly in science by comparing our sensory representations across people, but we also do it by thinking abstractly, conceptualizing abstractly. And you know, one of the things that's interesting about abstractions is it's not clear whether they're more or less real than the things they're abstracted from. You know, this is a perennial debate among, let's call them ontologists, who are interested in the fundamental nature of reality itself, in some sense independent of conceptual structures. Are numbers more or less real than the things they represent? It's a really hard question to answer, because knowing, like, using numbers as a representational system gives you unbelievable power. And there are mathematicians that believe that there isn't anything more real than mathematical representations. Now, it depends to some degree, of course, on how you classify reality. That's the problem with the question, like, is A equivalent to B? The answer to that always is, well, it depends on how you define A, and it depends on how you define B. So generally it's not a very useful question, but you can still get the point that there's something very real about abstractions. Incredibly real, because otherwise why would you bother with them? They wouldn't give you any handle on the world. So what's the most useful, or what's the broadest possible level of abstraction, and is there any utility in thinking in that manner? And I tried to make the case last time that in the mythological world there are 3 categories, or 4 depending on what you do with the strange 4th category, because the 4th category is sort of the category of uncategorizable entities. And so it's sort of the category of everything that not only do you not know, but you don't know it. Or you could think about it as the category of potential. I actually think that's the best way to think about it, is that it's the dragon of chaos is the category of potential. And I do believe that where our materialist view is essentially wrong. I think that the proper way of looking at being is that being is potential, and from that potential, whatever consciousness is extracts out the reality that we inhabit. Anyways, that's certainly the mythological viewpoint, but it's not just a mythological viewpoint. It's a sequence of ideas, for example, that deeply underlies the thinking of Jean Piaget. And Piaget, by the way, was very interested in reconciling the gap between religion and science. That's really what he devoted his life to doing. And so, and there are other streams of philosophy, and I would say Heidegger, the phenomenologists, are thinking along lines that are similar to this as well, because Heidegger was concerned not with the nature of material reality, but with being as such. And so you can extract out the viewpoint that I just described from mythology, but it isn't the only source of such, what would you call it, hypotheses is probably the right idea. So the idea, you can think about this as a bootstrapping process in some sense. Is in order for anything to get going, it has to bootstrap itself up and become more and more complex as it does that. So it's like, this is the answer to the chicken and egg problem, right? Which was first, the chicken or the egg? Well, neither. Something from which both the chicken and egg were derived, right? Because the ultimate answer to that is the answer to how there are things at all. Who knows? But at some point there were neither chickens nor eggs, but there were the things that were the precursors to those things. And so they spiraled upwards in some sense, and those initial proto-entities, single-celled animals I mean, you can go back farther than that, but we could say, well, single-cell animals differentiated over time, right? And there's this looping process that differentiates out into both the chicken and the egg. So, but what the question is, what do you need in order for that process to begin? And that's really the question of what the fundamental constituent elements of reality are. And the mythological hypothesis is that there's three or four. One is the fact that there has to be something that manifests itself as an observer. It's something like that. Some kind of observer. Now, where that process of observation starts in the phylogenetic chain is very, very difficult to tell. You know, we might say, well, there's certainly no possibility of a conscious observer until there's a differentiated nervous system. But then prior to the emergence of differentiated nervous systems, there were animals that were complex enough to react with the environment in a manner that, well, single-celled animals, they're quite complex. I mean, some of them are unbelievably complicated, you know. They can move themselves through space, they can orient, they can follow chemical trails. They're not stupid by any stretch of the imagination. Now, to what degree they have being, you know, as something they can represent, well, we don't have to speculate on that, but the proto-elements of conscious being are there. So you need a being, you need the structure of that being through which the entirety of being itself is interpreted, and you need the surround. It's something like that. And so I conceptualize that as something that knows, that's the knower, what it knows, that's the interpretive structure, and that which needs to be known. Or you could conceptualize that as the individual in explored territory nested inside unexplored territory. That's another way of thinking about it. Or you can think about it as the individual inside culture and the individual culture as nested inside nature. That's another way of looking at it. Or you can think of it as the knower and in order surrounded by chaos. That's another way of thinking about it. But all these things, you know, they're all attempts to articulate the same underlying structure. You see that in narratives continually, and I think Pinocchio is a very good example of that, because in Pinocchio you have the culture, that's Geppetto, and Geppetto is obviously creative but also insufficient and dead, which is why he ends up in the belly of the whale. You have the blue fairy, who's Mother Nature for all intents and purposes. The negative feminine doesn't manifest itself much in the Pinocchio story, except implicitly in the form of the whale, the thing at the bottom, which is more like the dragon of chaos than something feminine, that swallows up culture. But you have nature, or culture, Geppetto, nature, the blue fairy, and then the puppet, Pinocchio. And, you know, from a strictly scientific perspective, we think of human beings as nothing but the children of nature and culture, and that pushes you towards a kind of deterministic view. What causes your behavior? Well, it's either nature or culture, because there isn't anything else. But that isn't how the mythological story lays itself out, because it says there is something else, and that's whatever your consciousness is. And that consciousness seems to be able to work with nature and culture in a non-deterministic manner in order to bring, well, in order for what? In order to bring itself forward. I mean, and that's really, and what's interesting about that, I think, is that it isn't obviously just the plot of Pinocchio. It's virtually the plot of any story, is the story of the development of the individual. Now, the story is order, chaos, higher order, roughly speaking. So you can get variants of that. You can get order collapses into disorder and nothing is resolved. That's a tragedy, right? And you can get, so you don't have to have the entire story represented in a story, but you get fragments of it. It's a classic U-shaped story. And what it is the story of the development of the individual across time as a consequence of his or her adventures in time and space. And every story is exactly that. And those are representations of the manner in which you come to be in the world, for better or for worse. And it's differentiated, so the individual has a negative and a positive element, and culture has a negative and a positive element, and nature does as well. And that makes the potential for plots much broader. And I think it's also very useful to know that entire story, because I think it's one of the things that protects you against ideology. It's like, okay, if someone tells you a political story, or a story of any sort, you can always ask, well, where are the missing characters? Human beings are terrible, they've erected a culture that's destroying the planet, and nature is benevolent and pristine. It's like, yeah, fair enough, accurate, but you're missing half the characters. Because humans are not just terrible, rapacious creatures, and culture is not just a destructive force, and nature is by no means on our side. So where's the missing characters? You need all the characters in the representation to get it right. And I really believe this to be true. So for example, if you want to protect yourself against trauma as you move forward in life, you have to be very aware of the three negative characters. You have to know that the human individual has an adversarial element that's malevolent right to the core. And if you don't know that and you run across someone who's malevolent, you will end up damaged. So because first, you won't be able to defend yourself. You'll just be like a ripe fruit tree for the plucking. And second, the mere existence of someone like that will pose such a threat to the way that you've organized the world that it might collapse on you. That happens to people all the time. So it really matters whether you know these categories, and it matters that you know that culture can become tyrannical. But that it's also the father that's given you everything. And it matters that everything good comes from nature, and that we need to live in harmony with nature to some degree, but that it's also hell-bent on our destruction every second. And it's very paradoxical. It's a hard thing to reconcile with a thought structure like modern science that's based on a strict logic that always says something can't be itself and its opposite at the same time. But human beings can certainly be something and its opposite at the same time. And anything truly complex can have that, and does have that nature. If someone offers you a new job, you think, well, that's positive. It's like, no, it's not. It's positive and negative and complex. It might be the solution to your problem, but at the same time, it's going to generate a whole host of other problems. So lots of times, we're encountering entities in some sense that have an internally paradoxical structure, and we have to deal with that entire set of paradoxes, or we don't survive. It's really a matter of survival. Okay, so and then there's this overarching symbol, which is the dragon of chaos, which is potential itself, and it's the potential from which all of these categories emerge. And so the most abstract category of our imagination is that which is beyond our understanding, the category of that which is beyond our understanding. And that seems to me to be represented, because we can only use the representational structures that we evolved, is that it's represented in our paradoxical representation of the predator and the treasure that lies beyond the perimeters of our safe societies. So what's out there beyond? Well, we don't know, but we need to know, because we need always to deal with what we don't know. So weirdly enough, we have to come up with a category of what we don't know in order to start formalizing a theory about how we might progress towards it and interact with it. It's a very paradoxical idea. And there's a paradoxical answer, right? It's the terrible predator that lurks in the unknown that also harbors something of great value. Perfect. Perfect. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I think that is a reflection of the fact that human beings are predator animals and prey animals at the same time. So what's out there in the terrible darkness? Something that can destroy you, but also something that you absolutely need. So how do you prepare yourself for that? And that's the ultimate question of life. It's not how do you deal with death, although death is a subcomponent of the terrible unknown, I would say. It's how do you deal with that which is beyond your understanding, which is constantly manifesting itself in the world. And that manifests itself every time you categorize something and the thing escapes from the category. And that happens most in interpersonal relationships because people are so damn complicated. You get them figured out and boxed in. You even make a contract that neither of you will jump outside the box, but you jump outside the box continually. And that's why a relationship requires constant negotiation and reconceptualization, because you do not exhaust the person with your perceptual categories. And of course, you don't exhaust the world with your perceptual categories ever.